So this encourages people to take bigger risks, and that contributed to the whole thing. So the general point I'm making is there's a very interesting debate out there of macro versus micro interpretation. Jeff Reed, I see, is somebody who's making a macro interpretation, and now his recent revisions have a micro in there, but there's quite a lot of other people who are stressing the micro interpretation problem, and that's leading to a very interesting international political economy debate about how's that going to work itself out, what are the different policy requirement solutions, and I think it's a very interesting comparative one because since countries are so different, have different political economies and different regulatory politics, they're going to work out different solutions of that, and I think that helps explain why countries have not had the same degree of crisis. From a policy point of view, they did not have the same degree of crisis because they didn't have the same micro-regulatory regime in finance and all these other areas. So that's a very interesting thing. I see this as a crisis in the, when Alan Greenspan says I was wrong, I thought that the counterparties would pay more attention to what was going on. That's a pretty big ideological admission that private bonding and private market solutions are not going to be sufficient in the area of finance. He unfortunately has joined the ideological crusade since then, as the Republicans are now saying that it's all Fannie and Freddie, the mortgage things, that has nothing to do with these other issues. And so Greenspan, I saw recently, joined. That's a nice ideological way of saying that it's all the fault of the Democrats for providing loans to poor people, and that's what drove the whole financial way, and that's interesting, I think, very political way of distracting attention. An interesting thing is the recent report on the American regulatory thing, and the way the different political groups have lined up on that is a very interesting thing. So I think that we're seeing a lot of very interesting debates on that. And then, when all that to me starts to move down an interesting path, another dichotomy that we're used to using that I see now in crisis and all this is a crisis about sovereignty and what it means. I started my talk talking about these issues about what are the international regulations on things like capital adequacy regulations, the Basel agreements, but also what are the things about what are we going to allow to happen in the definition of risks and the nature of the instruments. And so we see this, the intensification of the international economic coordination. I think we're really done with the phase in which getting countries to promote growth by getting free trade, all that it meant was that you were going to lower tariffs and allow competition. But now I think the game is more difficult. You have to start working on regulatory coordination in the micro details of the economy. So the Europeans have been facing this for some time when have been fighting about corporate governance regulations, hostile takeovers. Europeans have been fighting for a long time about whose rules, would you allow a hostile takeover, and what would that look like? And what were the security market regulations? So I think that debate is intensifying, and I think that is a debate which undermines questions of sovereignty, because it not only do we have a problem of too big to fail, but we have a problem of what you do inside your country puts other people at risk, right? If you're running an economy which is creating these big unstable structures, like banks and financial institutions, you're putting people at risk. And so other countries cannot quietly sit by and watch you do that. And so the problems of international coordination are no longer, I think have become more difficult. They're no longer just matters of getting agreements on lowering your tariff levels or agreements on letting your airplanes land with each other and stuff like that. But they really get down to pension systems, corporate governance issues, shareholders, the role of unions and wage and labor thing. We've been there in some areas for some time, but I think that is intensifying, and I think that intensifies the problems of the role of the unit of the system. And so let me wind up, since I think I've got to have at least some time for questions. So I think that what all this shows is that some of the big categories are really in trouble. And I started out by saying I think that the North-South distinction along with dependencia, the Washington Consensus, things like that were in big trouble because the variety within these categories was so large that they really wipe out the meaning of the big categories. And I cannot stop without complaining about another category that bothers me enormously, which is Huntington's class of civilizations, has struck me along with Northwest on these terrible ideas, because it assumes that the civilization is actually a uniform thing and that it has some coherence, and it doesn't stress the divergence within each of the civilizations that he talks about. So how we can look at Chinese civilization and not think about the many different Chinas that we have observed over the last 30 or 40 years is a great puzzle to me. So I think that what we're seeing is that we're seeing a lot more variety and variance at the micro detail of each of the big categories that we're looking at. And that leaves kind of a problem for us. You know, we need categories to make generalizations. We need big categories. And what are we going to do? I think that we have to start looking at the particular, at finding ways of using. I think that the disciplines are instruments or tools or concepts that are to be used in illustrating the specificity, so that something like an incentive is a very good tool, but it doesn't mean that all the countries are going to organize their incentives in quite the same way. And so I think that we need to be finding methods for doing that. We need to be enjoying the diversity. We need to be enjoying the diversity that we're observing. I think Philippe said something like this yesterday, that I was struck by the story he told going around the world and seeing how much variety there was. And so the interesting question is, what are the theoretical, as people observe the variety, as the Chinese look at the specificity of their experience, what are the kind of the theoretical constructs that they're going to generate? How are they going to use the theoretical constructs that they have to make sense out of that? I think another fascinating dichotomy that's in trouble is international relations that I spent a good part of my life with is based on a historical dichotomy between anarchy and authority. Well, that's really in trouble, that idea, because as my colleague David Lake says, there's a lot more authority in the anarchy, and how much authority, the distinction of domestic politics is different from international relations, because you have authority in domestic politics. Well, now when we look a few thousand miles away, we see Mubarak crumble fairly fast. That that shows that we should never take the authority of a state for granted. We cannot assume that that's a constant. We have to problematize that the same way that we have to problematize the degree of hierarchy and order that exists at the level of anarchy. So I think I'm ending, Lourdes, I don't have a systematic kind of categories to offer about how to make sense out of all of this, because I think what we're observing is that it doesn't have that there's a tremendous, what's really striking to me about all the advanced capitalisms that behave in a different way, the developing countries are behaving in a different way. This crisis is showing, I mean, the fun part of the book that I wrote about this struck me that the crisis reveals the varieties of the experience of the universal stimulus that these countries are all experiencing. So the shockwave, Lehman Brothers collapses and a shockwave goes around the world, and we can use it to see the variety of what countries do. And I think that's what strikes me as this time only on a bigger scale, because we have so many other countries involved. I think the great thing about Brazil, it's under perfect timing. If we looked at I think the great thing about Brazil, what Brazil and Turkey, China, these other countries are doing is that they're making the international market economy more complicated, more difficult, more variety. They're elevating people out of terrible poverty, all of which is a very good thing. And I understand that Danny Roderick was here recently and made a speech about how, now that the United States is no longer the hegemon, we're going to regret it because there's nobody to lead the world economy. Well, that's an interesting set of questions, of which the answer is out. But I think that since we're moving into clearly an ever more multipolar economy, that how that multipolar economy is that we're moving at the same time to a multipolar economy with so much interconnection that the issues about regulation and uniformity are also getting more intense. And the risks of systemic disruption are rising, while at the same time the political authority to resolve those regulatory things is going to happen.